So thank you everybody for tuning in to the third event of the Summer Equine Speaker Series. Tonight we have Extension's very own Dr. Jaime Garzon. Dr. Garzon is an assistant extension professor and dairy forage educator with UMaine Cooperative Extension. He received his bachelor's in animal science and a master's in animal production from the National University of Columbia, and then received a PhD in agronomy from the University of Florida. Dr. Garzon has a passion for livestock production systems, grasslands, ecosystem services, and nitrogen management. While his primary role with Extension focuses on dairy forage education, much of his knowledge and expertise around pasture management and forages can certainly apply to equine pasture management. Some of you tuning in may have actually reached out to Dr. Garzon for forage analysis interpretation and other pasture management questions. Dr. Garzon, we're so glad that you're here tonight to share your knowledge as it relates to equine care. And with that, I will hand it over to you.
Well, Rachel, thank you very much for your bright introduction. As you said, at this moment, because of my position, I started being most related to dairy industry, but actually, I think from October this year, I will start to be more focused not only in dairy, but also in the other kind of industry that we have here that is related to forages. So we are talking about equine, we have pigs, even poultry, beef cattle, and related. So just to start the presentation, the topics that I want to mention this day, it's pasture management and horses, the what, the when, and the how. I usually have many questions from people that have horses, and it is curious to see that there is some care and some specific management that you need to be careful, especially when we want to differentiate the care that we need to have with ruminants, say cows, say beef cattle, or with horses. Because in this case, these animals are more delicate and the digestive system is kind of different. So just to start making a broad introduction of this topic, I want for all of you to see this scenario. That is what we usually saw when we are, see when we are in a farm. And actually, we are seeing this like a very homogeneous landscape, you know? So you have the grass, like a very huge land of grass, that is the pasture, and that will provide the food for your animals, that being in this case, the horses. But actually, in this homogeneous landscape, a lot of things are happening. And that is more related in how is the interaction between many of the spheres that we are seeing in this landscape. So we have the air, the soil, the plant, and the animal. And all these spheres are communicating and interacting with the others. So having into account that these systems are are complex, and if you are starting impacting one, you will be impacting the others. So it's not something that is so linear, it's more into the cycle. That is something that is very important because nowadays we know that the grasslands are complex systems that will help us if we know how to manage them. For this presentation, so I want to talk about what is the pasture management related to equine productions. And in this case, I can relate this pasture management starting with the what in these four different topics that I will start speaking more focused in each of those. So we have the forage budgeting, we have the forage quality, the species selection, and the grazing management. It is important to know that even with these different factors that we have here, any of those are important. And in all of that, you need to have always a very careful management and monitoring. It's very important. It doesn't matter which perspective, which front we are seeing here, all of those need that careful management and monitoring. So to start each of those, we have the first one is the forage budgeting. This is also called here in Maine as the grazing plan. This is related is to determine how much forage feed you need to produce from your pastures. That is just to plan ahead to be sure that all the land that you have are producing enough food for your animals. And for this grazing plan, we can like subdivide that topic in three little topics more: the soil, the plant, and the animal. A lot of this forage budgeting is related to information. And that's why all of these factors need to provide specific information from different fronts. From the soil, you need to know how much is the area available for pastures in your operation and in your place, and as well how much is your storage capacity, because it's not only the land that you have to produce pastures, to have the grass growing, but it's also to know what is the area that you have to storage that forage when the growing season is off. So for example, if you are buying hay, it is important to have a barn or some roof over that hay to don't lose those nutrients from that you are buying. So it's important also to consider that, and in consideration to all the biomass that your place are producing and storing. For the plant, it is important to notice here how much is the biomass accumulation and the nutritive value. Because in this case, you need to know how much grass your pastures are producing. It's not just to know that they are producing a lot or a little, depending on the height. Is to know how much pounds, how much dry matter they are producing. Because later you will relate that with the intake of your animals. And in that way, you can calculate if the grass that you are producing is enough for the animals you have. And of course, this is not only related with the amount of biomass, but also with the nutritive value, the quality, the nutrients that biomass is providing. And from the part of the animal, you need to know how many animals do you have, how much is the average weight, because remember that usually when you want to calculate the intake of your animal, you can relate that with the average weight, and of course the physiological state, because it's not the same to calculate how much grass a filly will need in comparison to a mare or in comparison to a stallion. So all these things can change a little, and those are the adjustments that you need to do for your grazing plan. The following subtopic here is the forage quality. And here it's important to recognize that when we are talking about forage quality, we are talking about two different factors: the forage nutritive value and the intake of the animal. So usually when people see and read about forage quality, they are always thinking or referring how much nutrients that biomass has. But actually, it's not only how much it's available, it's how much your animal can eat. For the forage nutritive value, there is some specific characteristics that you want to measure and you want to have into account. For one part is the chemical composition, because as the dry matter, very important if you are working with haze. The crude protein, the amount of fibers, NDF, ADF, or lignin, the TDN, or total digestible nutrients, or soluble sugars, and finally the minerals. All of this is more related to the diets, but at least when we are talking about forages, we also want to fulfill those requirements, at least with crude protein and with digestibility. Because the digestibility is how much is that capacity of the grass to be digestible and to be taken for the animal. And usually we can relate that with the energy. And for having these values in your operation, here in Maine, well, not in Maine, but we have some laboratories that you can use where you can send samples. The first one is the Equi-Analytical. This is part of a laboratory in New York. It's the one. Is the one that I usually recommend. And also we have the Cumberland Valley Analytical Services. Both laboratories are good, but the prices can change depending on the package that you are asking, the nutrient that you want to know, and of course, the results also may change a little, but it not be so different to say that one laboratory is better than the other. So both are very good. And just here between us, usually Cumberland Valley has results faster than Dairy One. But Dairy One he has more like is more experience broadly. So to start talking about here about forage quality, here I brought two different results of hay tests, one from Equianalytical and the other one just for Dairy One. As I said, Equianalytical is just part of Dairy One, but Equianalytical is making all the calculations more related for horses' diets and for horses' nutrients, horses' feed. Dairy one is more related to cattle, small ruminants, even pigs and poultry. But even with that, both analyses should be similar, except for the calculation of energy that I will recommend more in that case, equianalytical. But in this case, just for you to understand, when you receive these results from the laboratory, it is important that you can check the columns that are there. So the first one is just to see that we have like two different columns, two big columns. The first one is say as sampled in the analytical or as fed in dairy one. And the second big column is the dry matter or DM in dairy one. The difference between both is that at sample is how much is the nutrients of that hay at the moment that they start processing when they receive it with that specific characteristics, with that water that they can have, like how is that in that moment. But my recommendation for this broad calculation is just to go always to the dry matter column. And this is because even when we are working with hay, usually hay should be with a maximum of 10% of humidity. That 10% can change, and even the water concentration in the grasses can change very fast in the same day. Because of that, we need to have like one specific and uniform perspective that will not change even if we are having a rainy day or we are delaying more the drying or our hay. And that is the dry matter. That's why it's that important. So usually when you want to decide, when you want to define the nutritive value of your grass or your hay, always try to go to the percentage of dry matter. And now, just to start looking a little more in these tests, the first thing I will recommend you to see, of course, the percentage of dry matter, because the idea is that hay should be always less than 10%. Maybe with square bales, that can increase to 20% this content of humidity. So actually 80% of dry matter, 90% of dry matter, depending. So in comparison, in these samples, you can see that in the equianalytical results, we are having a 92% of, but almost 93% of dry matter. Meanwhile, in the dairy one sample, we have 91.4. So actually, in both cases, the dry matter concentration is appropriate, and that will say that the dry process for making the hay was good, and that will maintain better the nutrients in that grass. The second thing that you can go later is with the crude protein. The crude protein is a factor that will say how much nitrogen and how much protein that grass is providing to your horses for activity, for producing muscle, for producing cells, and all that conformation part of the muscle system. In this case, you can see that here the crude protein in one is 9.3%, and in the other is 9, sorry, because remember that as fed is different from dry matter, so it's 9% in dairy one. So just to start having those numbers in your head, I will give you this little table that I do just to try to referencing what is the number that you can just check when you are reviewing this analysis. So as moisture, as I said, should be less than 10%. Crude protein should be higher than 9%. Actually, like the minimum value, minimum acceptable value is 7%, because below of that, you will start having problems with the digestive system in the animals. So hopefully the hay should be 9% or more. Later, you're going to see the concentration of ashes that in equianalytical is 5.3 and in dairy one is 5.1. With the ashes, the ideal is to have less than 10% of ashes, because actually in here is where the minerals of the hay are. But it's not only those minerals related to the forage, it can be also that inert material that is coming from the soil. So usually, if you are seeing some samples that are higher proportion of ashes, more than 10%, that could mean that when in the process of mowing, the producer of the haymaker just was too low and start catching soil within the forage. So actually, in this case, you are increasing the weight of the hay because you are paying for that soil as well, and it will not be taken in a good way for your animal. It will not cause any problem with the digestive system, but actually that is like a correct manner to do hay. So the idea is to have less than 10% of ashes. The next one that I want to check, well, actually the last three, we have the water-soluble carbohydrates, WSC, the non-fiber carbohydrates, and the total digestible nutrients. These three last ones are more related to how much soluble sugars we have available in that hay, and actually is from here when your animal will take the energy. That is also very related with digestibility, but in many tests, many packages, paying digestibility will increase the cost of the sample. So in this case, you want to have a good number of 10 water-soluble carbohydrates, 15 non-fiber carbohydrates. This one is always a little higher than the WSC, because the non-fiber carbohydrates are including also the water-soluble plus the starch. So that's why usually the non-fiber should be bigger, greater than water-soluble carbohydrates. And finally, the total digestible nutrient that should be around 60%. One not exception, but I think it's something important to consider with horse production, with equine production, is and it was something that I was very surprised when I arrived to Maine, is actually here the grasses are full of sugar. Here, usually back in Colombia or even in Florida, where I did my PhD, because we are working with tropical grasses in there. Usually the concentration of fibers is very high. Usually NDF, ADF are very high, and the soluble sugars are not that much. That's why usually you need to supplement with molasses and other things. On the contrary, when I arrived here to Maine, I just realized that the grasses usually here are very high of sugar. Being the case that horse people just letting me know that because of that, if you are having some specific grasses that are more designed for dairy production, for those big nutritional requirements for producing milk, those grasses can produce metabolic syndrome in horses. That I didn't understand that at the beginning, but later they just told me that actually that is a kind of diabetes for horses. And it's just because we may provide very high sugar forages that in the middle or long term can make our horses sick. That's why when we are talking about here, these last three, water-soluble carbohydrates, non-fiber carbohydrates, and total digestible nutrients, I am not telling here just to have less than or more than something. The idea is to be like in 10, 15, and 60 and go with that range, just to know that that grass, it will not be cause any damage to your horse in the long term. So that is like the what that I wanted to explain to you. And now we need to continue the presentation so we can pass it for the when. When we're talking about the when, is when to plant, when to seed, when to take advantage of those forage material that we are available here in Maine. So one of the things that are very important to recognize is that here in Maine, the forages can grow in different curves. And that will depend if we have a cool season perennial, as happened with the Timothy or the red clover, a cool season annual, as happened with the oats or even the winter pea, or warm season annuals, as happened with the sorghum or with the sun hemp. In this case, we can see that even so, the idea here is to try to maintain a constant source of feed, of green feed for your animals during all the growing season. Starting from March, April, May, be careful with the muddy season because you don't want to impact the soils, but starting the grazing period too early until October, November. Be careful in here because you also want to give the plants some time to recover and store some energy on the roots to survive the winter. So that's why usually our growing season, like our grazing period, starts usually from middle April until the end of October. So it's important to recognize. And of course, for example, in this curve, you can see what is happening to May, June, July, August, that actually is the moment when the summer slump happens. The moment when the temperature is too high for our cool grasses to grow in a good way, with a good performance. But in that case, for just to cope this lack of forages, we have some warm season annual that we can use as well. Some specific characteristics of these two types of forages. We have the cool season. So actually for the seeding, it is important to notice that here in Maine, usually we have two different times for the seeding of cool season forages. The first one is early spring. That is the most common time in Maine, just after the winter. And that is because it's usually the soil usually have a very good moisture condition. The situation here, as I say, is the muddy season. So you want to start working with that soil at the moment where you can go with your buggy or with your tractor and implements and you don't get stuck. So you need to, usually because of that, we have to wait until May. And for the late summer, that is happening after the summer, usually it's important here is, first of all, you need to start the planting of any plant 6 to 8 weeks before the first frost. And that is happening here, depending of your place or where are you located in Maine, that could start at the end of October or in November. So that's why it's important for you to count at what moment you can start. Usually, we are talking about early September. This can be done after a small grain harvest. That is very important if you have something related, for example, with corn or other kind of cash crops. And you will have less weeds because in this case, all the weeds that were growing were the summer ones. But because it's starting to fall the temperature, those ones are start to die. So usually the fight against weed is less when you're sitting in late summer. But be careful because usually after the summer, the soil could be too dry for the seeding. So you need also to check that for making that seed bed appropriate for your plants. And finally, we have also the warm season annuals. Of course, you want to apply that in early summer. Actually, the main moment when you want to do that is with the soil rich and approximately of 60 to 65 Fahrenheit of degrees Fahrenheit of temperature. And that usually is happening in June to early July. Usually it's like the main requirement for them. And now what we are talking about is these characteristics, now we can start talking about different species. So for the species selection, for cool season perennials, we have plenty of them. Here I'm giving you approximately 10 different species of cool season perennials, approximately another 10 species of cool season annuals, and 7 species of warm season annuals. And here I just put some species of grasses as well as legumes, as happened, for example, with the cool season perennials, with the alfalfa or the clovers or the beechwood trefoil, cool season annuals of the winter pea, the radish, even the Bersin clover, and the warm season annuals with the forage soybean and the cowpea. However, something that is important always to remember for select and specific species for your equine operation, you need to select persistent forages. You need to select healthy forages that will not produce any disease or bad situation with your animals. And of course, beware the metabolic syndrome. That's why for equine production, for equine operations, I would recommend to go more with these ones. For cool season perennials, the Kentucky bluegrass, the Timothy, the smooth rock grass. For cool season annuals, oats and rye. Also, triticale is a good choice at the beginning of the spring, if possible. And for warm season annuals, first of all, please avoid the sorghum family. And here we are talking about sorghum, Sudan grass, and sorghum Sudan grass, because those grasses, even they produce a lot of biomass in summer, they grow very fast, control very good some weeds. They also can produce and store prussic acid. And the problem with that is with not appropriate management, that could be produce a very serious intoxication in animals. And knowing that this digestive system in horses is more delicate than is happening with cattle, for example, the main recommendation is just to avoid these three species. So forage sorghum, Sudan grass, and sorghum Sudan grass, please avoid those for as warm season animals. Usually for the selection, and actually there is some studies in Massachusetts where people are trying to use the crabgrass that usually is considered a weed in many gardens and in many as turf. But for horses, there has been to appear that it's a very good possibility because even it's not as good with nutritive value, it will fulfill the requirements of horses. And actually, the crabgrass has a very good growth in summer and will avoid the growth of other weeds. So it could be a very good approximation, as the same as the millet or the teff. Okay, and now we're speaking a little more about these specific grasses that I will recommend for equine productions. Talking about perennials, that usually pasture that you will see in equine operations. The first one is the Timothy. For me, the Timothy and same as the Kentucky bluegrass, those two grasses are the more combative, are the more adaptable here in Maine. They will adapt to acid soils, they will adapt to wet or to dry soils both. And for example, with the Kentucky bluegrass is very, very persistent. And that is very important when we are talking about horses in the case that we have overgrazing. I will speak a little more later. In the case that we want to produce a little more and have more diversity in our pasture, that is good because you want also to improve your resilience of your pastures. It is possible also to have smooth bottom grass when your soil is dry, it have a good drainage. Or in the opposite side, if your soil is too wet and too heavy, you can go with the red canary grass. With the red canary grass, I will say that be careful with this one because you need to choose those varieties that are low with oxalates. So that you don't want to have some like native varieties that may be higher in oxalates and that can cause problems with the gums of your horse. And of course, the mix of Timothy, Kentucky, and Kentucky bluegrass is like the best mixture that I will say, and will be adapted very well in many different conditions. But now we're talking about diversity. It's not only about grasses. Here we're talking about forages. So what about the legumes? Here in Maine, it's very curious to see, especially if you have organic production or you are asking for organic products. Usually for the supplementation of nitrogen, the legumes are starting to be very important in the composition of the grasslands. And in this case, you will have clovers, different red or white clover. You can have hairy vetch or even beechwood trefoil. And it's not only the fixation of the nitrogen that this physical product that you can touch. The legumes are providing so many ecosystem services that are being added to the grasslands. For example, here we have the 4 different categories of the ecosystem services from grasslands and those specific services that the legume is providing. So in the provisioning category, of course, it's impacting the forage yield because in this case, it's providing more nutrients or more nitrogen that can impact the growth of the grass and will increase the nutritive value. Remember the crude protein? Well, usually when you have a hay or a pasture with clovers or with other legumes, that percentage of crude protein on the pasture can can pass from 9 to 13 or to 15%. And the good thing is actually because of that service that is in the supporting category, the nitrogen fixation, all that crude protein that you are providing to your animal, it's free because the plant, the clover, the legume is fixing that from the air and putting that into the soil, being able later for the animal to eat it. Also, the legumes are providing a better litter decomposition that is related with the release of nutrients of the material that we have in the pastures. In the regulating category, the legumes and even the grassland themselves, they are cycling better the greenhouse gas emissions and increasing the diversity. And remember again, when we are talking diversity, you can relate that directly with resilience, with the adaptation of that pasture to any bad condition that you can have suddenly. And that is something that is acquiring more importance nowadays with this variability in our weather. And finally, some cultural ecosystem services provided by legumes and grasslands, as happened with the photography, with the aesthetics, and even in all of these, I will consider also that is from the regulating and supporting the pollination. It's very important in this case to provide the sources for our bees, just to provide a better pollination and more increase in that way the diversity in our pasture. But again, we're talking about here about horses, so there is something that it is important for people to know, and actually that is something that has been asked sometimes here in my job, and this is the clover toxicity. This is something that happens in Maine. We need to recognize that. It happens because in some cases, the horses or the animals are consuming a lot of slavamine, that is a chemical produced by the fungus Rhizoctonia leguminicola. When mild intoxication, that is the normal behavior that you will see usually with this clover toxicity, is a lot of drooling and just appearing foam in the mouth of the horse. With more severe intoxications, you will see diarrhea, colic, frequent urination, and abortion. And plants that are impacted usually at any clover, red clover, white clover, alsike clover, and even alfalfa. Something that is important to recognize here is that not is that common that happen. Usually it will happen as you can see there, because the clover is infected with a fungus. And in that case, something that you can check to be careful about this possible intoxication is just to check in your pasture the area with clovers to see those black spots in the leaves. Those black spots are the contamination with rhizoctonia, and probably they are the ones that are producing this slavamine that is causing the intoxication. And that's why usually the chronic symptoms and the severe intoxication happen is when you allow your horse to eat a lot. I mean a lot of that clover. So what can we do for treatment or to prevent that clover toxicity? First of all, and it's very important not only with clovers, but with any legume here in Maine, is try to maintain an approximately 30% of clovers in the pasture. Try to don't surpass that. You maybe can go even to 50%, but it is better to prevent and just allow the 30%. If you are seeing that the clover in your pasture are increasing and it's just like uncontrolled, the main situation that you can control that is by short mow or apply nitrogen in form of manure or fertilization, because in this case, this nitrogen will impact better the growth of the grass, and the grass will surpass the clover and will control the growth. Of course, if you are seeing areas when this clover is impacted with the rhizoctonia, with those black spots, avoid that affected area. And of course, just to replace and to avoid any worse intoxication, feed with hay. The idea with this is just to dilute the effect of the slavamine inside the body of the horse. And of course, if you are seeing that your horse is drooling, pues provide water. And at the end, if you are seeing a severe intoxication, of course, call a veterinarian. Very important. Another factor, another species that I want to talk here is about the alsike clover. The sticky clover, it's a mix. Actually, it's like a hybrid from the white clover and the red clover. And usually you will recognize that is because the flowers are between pink and white. It's not like the red clover that actually have very pink flowers, or the white clover that has white flowers. With the alsiki clover is in the middle. And usually the leaves with you will see it like a flat green. Usually when you are seeing a red clover or a white clover, you will see a watermark that is like a V that is just in each of the leaflets. With the alsiki clover, there are none. So when you are seeing this alsiki clover on your pasture, try to control it. Because for horses, I will not recommend to have any proportion of this clover on your pasture. It's toxic if it's ingested in high quantities, and it causes photosensitization that you will see some more like lesions in not pigmented areas, and also liver disease. As I said again, just to reach this point, when you have liver failure and that your animal will be very affected by the clover, it has to pass. Well, for say something, the animal have to eat a lot of this material. But if it's available in the pasture and the animal don't recognize it, it can eat it. So if you are seeing these flowers, these plants on your pasture, again, try to mow it or try to increase the growth of the pasture of the grass. And finally, just to start finishing this part of the when, on the when, the what and the when, we are missing the how. And with the how, here is more related to what is the pasture management itself. So with the pasture management, we are talking about here with three different factors: the frequency, the intensity, and the timing. The three of those are very important, and the three of those, you need to consider all those three for a good pasture management. The first one is the frequency. That means when the grazing can start, when the pasture is in the most appropriate shape to be eaten by the horse. And in that way, here in this figure, you can see like the green silhouette that we are seeing is how is the growing of the grass. It's starting very short. Later, for a moment, they have like an explosive growth and have a plateau at the end. That is how the biomass of any grass will behave. But at the same time, we are seeing here that, of course, if we are thinking in biomass, we are thinking that maybe we can wait more to have more biomass for our animals. But the problem is by waiting, we are decreasing the level of the nutritive value, of the concentration of those nutrients. So as you can see there in that line that is starting very high on the left side of the figure, protein, TDNs, and palatability, the preference, the flavor of the grass, it will decrease over time. Because with that growth of biomass, the grass is increasing fibers and insoluble materials that the animal cannot process. So the specific moment when you want to provide this grass for your animals is when these two lines intersect. And that is usually happen in the middle of the growing curve. Just for going in a more practical way, usually the main recommendation when it starts to grazing is when the pasture achieve approximately 12 to 15 inches of height of tall. That is a good reference, but actually it's not something that I would like to recommend because that growth of the pasture can change a lot depending of how was the weather in that growing season. If it was more shady, if it has a drought, if it was a lot of rain, that could change and make differences between the growth in the pastures. So that's why I just prefer to check a physiological state that you can see in the pasture when you are just walking around, and it's the bud stage. When you are seeing that the pastures, that the grasses, the seed head is starting to appear, that is the moment when we are in that intersection in the lines. So usually the main recommendation is just to start grazing when the seed heads starts to appear. Of course, in the pasture that is not easy because not all the plants will grow and the seed heads will appear all at the same time. So because of that, the recommendation is just when you are in your pasture waiting for start the grazing and you see that approximately 30% of your pasture are with seed heads, that is the moment when you can go with your animals and start the grazing. On the other side, we have the intensity. So in this case, we know when the grazing can start. Now we need to know when the grazing need to stop. In this case, this is an example with an orchard grass. Actually, it's just to show what is the grazing height and what that is important. And the idea is you need to allow your animals to eat your grass until reaching a specific height, because you always want to preserve those growing points for the next harvest, for the next growing season. Because of that, the main recommendation, and to protect those growing points, usually you want to maintain 4 inches of residue of stubble height in grasses, 5 to 7 inches in legume, or even with the Kentucky bluegrass, because of the growth that is very stoloniferous and produce rhizomes, so it's very creepy. They can go with 2 inches. But even with that, my main recommendation, like the magical number here, is just allow your animals to be on your pasture until they reach 4 inches tall of the residue. And I will say this is very important, very, very important with horses, because they have teeth in both jaws. Something that is not happening with cattle or with other small ruminants. Well, cattle are big and small ruminants, is actually they just have teeth in one jaw, and that helps to control this stopping, because they are not, is for them it's not easy to reach the soil, eating the grass. With the horses, because of that differences in the anatomy, they can't reach the soil. So it's very important that you control the number of animals in your pasture, how many days you will allow your animals in that pasture to reach those 4 inches, please. It's very important to avoid the overgrazing. And I saw that with horses, that is very easy. Just to say, okay, maybe I can provide this 1 day more, to the next day, you are reaching the 2 inches or maybe less. And by doing that, you are impacting the performance of the pasture in the future. A conjunction with this frequency and intensity, and something that is very, very good to explain, is about the stocking management. And this could be divided between the stocking, continuous stocking, and the rotational stocking. So in this case, so how many animals do you have? How much area do you have? And how much management you want to provide? When you are going to continuous stocking, you are leaving your animals in the same pasture through the whole growing season. This is the cheapest way to do this grazing period, but the problem is that you will need big areas for those animals, not only for running, but of course for eating. So you need to provide big areas. But as I said, it's cheaper. So that is the balance that you need to check. And of course, the rotational stocking is for animals to be rotated between different paddocks during the growing season. In here, you need to control more the intake and the behavior of your horses. You need to move them, maybe leaving 1 to 3 days in each paddock and moving to the next, just to leaving that 4 inches height. The good thing is actually with this rotational stocking is more efficient. You are controlling better what your animals are eating. You are controlling also the weight management, the weight like incidence as well, and in this case, you are providing the feed that the animals need. The problem is more expensive, because in here you will need more fences. Yeah, it could be transitional or permanent. You will need more fences. Maybe you will need to decide a sacrificial area for the animals to move, and you need to go more time there, just check, and it requires more management, so more workforce as well. Both are fine, both have the good and the bad things. That depends on what if we adapt better on your farm. Important, again, please avoid overgrazing. That is very important with horses, because with the overgrazing, you will see fast how your pasture start to degrade. And believe me, to recover a pasture is something that will be more expensive to prevent all the situation. And finally, with the timing, and this is very fun, because here in Maine, we can see that because of the weather, circumstances and conditions can differ if we have summer, fall, or winter. So because of that, with the timing, it's just to be important that if you want to produce, a grass that produce a lot, maybe you want to plant that on spring or summer. If you want to have some grass that will resist more, especially in those cold days that are starting from winter, you maybe want to do the stockpiling. That is another strategy. And of course, in winter, just leave the soil alone. Of course, you need the soil for your animals to run, to exercise, but be careful with the density, with the number of animals in these pastures, because you don't want to cause any compaction. And another important concept that is related to all of this, the what, the when, and the how, is what is called the toolbox. When you are talking about this grazing and pasture management, there are some tools that are important you to know that exist and consider using sometimes. The first one is the soil test. That is a valuable tool to know the state of your soil. My recommendation is that because the soil is a buffer, is stable. Usually it's good for you and for your pastures to do a soil test every 3 to 5 years. Because by the grazing, by the movement of the animals, even if you are providing manure or fertilization, you are changing the characteristics of that soil, and you want to know what is happening with that. With the hay test, of course, that is the answer to how many nutrients are you providing to your animals, and more important, how much nutrients are you paying for, especially if you are buying hay. So you want to know, you want to see, you want to provide a good quality for your hay to your animals. And finally, the grazing test is, remember, is just those very key factors. Remember to leave at least 4 inches stable height, and remember to calculate the yield in your pasture. In the photos in there, you can see different materials, different tools that you can use, as happened with the soil core for the soil test, the hay core for taking samples of hay, or the grazing stick for the grazing test. The grazing stick, you can have this tool from your NRCS office in your county, and it's very nice because in that little stick, it will give you the information of how is the height of your grass, how is the height for starting the grazing, for stop the grazing, or even how to calculate the green volumes of your pasture, just by knowing how to use that tool. Of course, here I'm also providing the QR codes and the YouTube web pages to show you how to make appropriately the soil, hay, and grazing test. And just to start finishing, because our time is running, another question and another topic that people are asking me about a lot when we are talking about pastures for horses is, what about weeds? So I was just want to relate some of the weeds that horse farms has asking me how to recognize it, how to manage those, especially in our production that are organic and the application of herbicides is kind of restricted. So the first one that I want to show you, if you have this plant on your pastures, probably you will have because it's everywhere, is the smooth bed straw. This is a perennial weed that is very invasive and opportunistic. It will bloom in late June, early July, just starting the summer, and even again in August. Has preferences by grazing animals. Well, has low preference because it's very hard stuff. So because of that, animal just try to avoid it. And the situation because of that, the animal prefer to eat the grass and left the smooth bedstraw. In that case, the bedstraw can just start flowering, producing seeds, and spreading. The main situation for controlling bedstraw actually is with the tillage. It's just to remove that plant from the base of the soil, remove the rhizomes, and bury that biomass into the soil. Use annual forages for 2 years also can be good in the case that you have high infestations, and in this case, if you have a pasture that is just full of bed straw, maybe the good way is just to till all the pasture, put some annual forages just to fulfill the requirements of your animals together with all their paddocks. And at the end, after those 2 years, just to break the cycle of the bed straw, you can start planting again a perennial. And be careful because there is another species that are like cousin of the smooth bed straw, that is the catchweed. It looks the same, it's very similar to the bed straw, but actually when you take the bed straw, if you feel that the stem is very smooth, is smooth bed straw, as for sure, but if you feel that is not smooth, that is maybe a little rocky, maybe that is like a zipper that you will feel, that is catch with. And with the catch with, I will recommend just to mow because that could cause mold irritation in sensitive animals. So in that case, the tilling and the mowing could be a better approximation if you don't want to apply herbicides. The goldenrod that is growing at this moment everywhere here in Maine, actually there is multiple species, some identified by hairs on seeds, and actually you will see that in many places the goldenrod as appeared in the photo are growing, and near to them are growing another very similar with the flowers are more defined. That is also goldenrod. It's rhizomatous perennial, so that makes a huge problem because it have rhizomes. Have leaves simple, lanceolate, or alternate, depending on the species, and the flower are yellow. The main, if you don't want to use herbicides, the main way that you can prevent the goldenrod, to just control the goldenrod, is by mowing. In this case, the idea is just to make the plant to use all the energy that she is storing from the photosynthesis into the roots, into the rhizomes. And by doing that, the idea is just to mow always after each grazing. So usually if you are leaving your animals for 2 or 3 days, leaving later for 15 days resting. After each grazing is very advisable to make all the mow just at least once per month, just to extenuate those roots and control the goldenrod in the medium or long term. The buttercup here is short-lived perennial and bloom usually in spring. The situation with buttercup is usually grazing animals do not consume it. They will consume it only if it's the only source of feed in the pasture. That is not the case. And in that case, that could be cause toxicity because it can cause blisters in grazing animals due to the proton pneumonia. That is a toxin that it produces. Usually, when you have a good pasture, the same pasture will control the buttercup. And in this case, because the pasture is growing more, it will cover the buttercup. Also, the application of manure or fertilization can help the control of the buttercup because they usually prefer those acidic and wet soils. So at the same time, liming or applying good ashes is also a good choice to control the buttercup. With the yellow rattle, it's summer annual that blooms in the middle of June and July. The situation with the yellow rattle is parasitic to other plants, so actually it will parasite other weeds. But at the same time, it will provide nutrients and make the species to grow. So usually this species is very related to acidic soils. So the main control for the yellow rattle, I will say, is the mowing and the application of forage, just for increasing the strength of the grass and cover the weed because of that. The red sorrel, Xeromatosus, it blooms in June and July. It could be a problem because that produces oxalates if stressed. It's not a common situation, but the good thing is actually it's not that difficult to control. The mowing, it will help at the same time with the tilling, but most time with the mowing is enough, just constant mowing. That is the situation. You need to be constant with that. And finally, the common milkweed. This is my last one, and I put it in the end because it's very, very important. Common milkweed, you will recognize it because it's milky sap, and every plant will produce galitoxin. That is a glycoside that impacts respiration and neurotoxins. Horses are very sensitive to this plant. So it's very important to stop infestation before they start. And usually the way that you want to do that is for sure by mow. Mow to eliminate the flowers and mow again to extenuate the roots to avoid having this milkweed on your pastures. It's very important. And in general, the best weed control, the main recommendation that I would say is to have a healthy pasture. If you have a pasture that is growing fine, that has no lack of nutrients, the pasture will cover all those weeds. And even the weeds will still grow, but the proportion will be not that high that will cause problems to your horses. And for sure, this is all this information that I provided here. I just want to let you know that it is available also in these two bulletins that we have available for free in our library in Cooperative Extension, the pasture and hay for horses, and a whole category for equine bulletin and fact sheets in our library. And finally, I want just also to invite you to these two events that I provided this year in Maine. The Maine Hay Contest that is ongoing. I'm just providing some recognition to those people that are producing hay in the better way. I am providing the program in this case is providing the sampling, is providing the shipping, the laboratory analysis costs, and at the end you will have the result of the hay that you are producing in your farm. And of course, to invite you as well to the Maine Forage Conference that will happen in November 2024, because my idea in here is just to put together all the people related to grazing and forage management here in Maine. Thank you very much for your attention. And of course, if you have questions, I think we have like now a open season, open season, an open space for questions. And if not, my information is up in this slide, my email, my phone numbers, or if you want to follow me and my work in Facebook or Instagram. Thank you very much.
Awesome, Jaime. Thank you so much. I'm going to give people a chance to enter questions in the Q&A while I also send out this poll. So we'll give folks a few minutes. Jaime, I have a question for you. I don't know how often you go into feed stores, but I I've noticed, there are commercially available like seed mixes that are on the shelves of like Tractor Supply or Abishan. Um, have you ever looked at those closely to see, like are those compatible, are the seeds compatible with Maine's climate? Because those are, available across the country. So I wanted to ask if you had ever looked at those.
Yes, I saw some of those, as you say, in Autubon and in Tractor Supply. The situation with those mixes, as you said, is that dealers just want to be sure that it will work in everywhere in the United States. And that's why usually those mixes will have 7 or 8 different species. So because if one is not working, maybe the other one will work. So the situation with that is just you need to be careful, is just to see if the species that you want are already there. For example, I know that in many cases that you want to provide forages for horses, you will need to see Timothy or Kentucky bluegrass or smooth brown grass in that mix. My question is, what will happen with the others? Are you paying for the other seeds that you will not use? Or maybe it should be better to go to another dealer that will provide like a bag full of the seed that you need. But the situation here is if you are a small producer, have just 2 acres of pasture. Well, if you go to those big dealers, they will take time to provide just the service. So that is the balance that you need to check. But for sure, you need to be careful because probably in those big mixes of 7 species, probably 3 will grow. The other one will not.
Oh, that's good to know. Yeah, I at my farm, we're renovating all of our fields. We just did our soil tests. So we're slowly trying to bounce it back. They were historically hay fields, so we need to lime them and then I think we'll fertilize and seed eventually. But
Mhm. Yeah, in that case, if you want just to have those specific species of seeds, you may want to go to some specific dealers that are related here in Maine for that one. So King Agri Seeds, Seedway, or even you can go to Paris Farm Union that they are also related, or Nutrient. They are also related and can provide that service for those specific species that you may want if you don't want to go with those big mixes.
awesome. Thank you. I don't see any questions in the chat. However, I'm sure you will receive some emails. But thank you so much, Jaime, for doing this tonight. And everyone will send out the recording very shortly. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
No, thank you very much. Thank you very much for you to give us this space and for me to introduce to all the equine industry, at least related with forages and pasture management.
Wonderful.